Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Mindful Education Summit. My name is David Treleaven, and I'm an educator and a trauma professional who's focused his work around trauma and mindfulness. And today for this session, I'm going to be talking to you about trauma-informed practices, specifically in educational settings. I've been working at this intersection around mindfulness and trauma for a while. And if there's one thing I've learned the last couple of years is that educators are by far the most engaged audience that I've worked with. Right from the onset of talking about this topic, a number of educators approached me and said, this is a conversation we are having and that we want to lean into here. I feel like there's a great awareness of trauma and the importance of understanding trauma in this community. So I'm really happy to be offering this session to all of you, and I want it to be useful for all of you. So thank you for being here, for your interest in the topic, for your work, and also investing time in what feels to me like a really important conversation about the integrity with which we are offering practices. So just a brief framing here around the topic. As many of you will know, mindfulness is just an increasingly popular program, intervention. I mean, when I'm at the supermarket, it's hard not to see some advertising happening around mindfulness. And it's being offered in a wide variety of settings, especially inside of education, the last 10 to 15 years. Such an amazing movement that has happened around offering mindfulness in the classrooms and the potential benefits of that for students, which you're going to be hearing a ton about over the course of the summit. At the same time, and this is where the topic that I'll be covering today comes in, research tells us that prevalence rates for trauma continue to be high. And the vast majority of us will live through a traumatic event, and then there'll be a smaller percentage of us that will actually develop symptoms, sometimes debilitating symptoms, in the aftermath of trauma. And so if you pull back from this far enough, what you see is that in any room where you will be offering mindfulness practices to a group, a classroom, a community, in all likelihood, there will be someone in that space who is struggling with trauma. And as I'll be talking about here on the webinar, that is not necessarily immediately a bad thing. I have met numbers of people, and there's also a number of people over the years. There's also research that says mindfulness can really help with trauma recovery, self-regulation. We'll be talking a little bit more about that. But what I've also learned through my research is that there are a number of people who are experiencing or struggling with trauma, who engage in some kind of contemplative practice, a mindfulness practice, a meditation, and end up struggling inside of practice. It actually exacerbates some of the symptoms that they're in. And so given this fact that mindfulness is so popular and that trauma remains prevalent, there's an urgency in this topic about how can we offer mindfulness instruction in a way that is sensitive to the needs of people who are struggling with trauma. That's the punchline of what I'm up to and what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And to me, why this is so essential in this moment is, if as a community of mindful educators, if we really do well here in this kind of watershed moment of having trauma-informed practice be really baked into our understanding of how we're offering mindfulness, I think that makes us way more effective, powerful, and accessible as a community who are offering mindfulness teachings to students. And at the same time, if we are to miss the ball here, and if the majority of mindfulness educators are offering teachings in a way that has no understanding or analysis of trauma, to me, it's both a missed opportunity and it has the possibility arise of people falling through the cracks. And those are the people that I've been both speaking to and learning from over the past 10 years. And in many ways with this session, I want to bring their voices here to you all and tell you, here are the stories that I've heard from students who had difficult experiences around mindfulness and meditation. Here's what they needed, here's what they learned. And we'll be talking really about best practices today. One thing before I dive into the material is, if there's one thing I've appreciated about the mindful educators who I've met, it's really moving to me, is that there is a deep commitment to the safety of students, that at a formative level, the teachers, and I mean, imagine many of you who are tuning into this session, this is here for you, they don't want to cause harm. And in hearing about this topic and saying like, wow, well, is there ways that I could prevent someone who's struggling with trauma, a student that I have, to avoid having a difficult experience? Then yes, I want to do that. Of course I do. So I'm just wanting to say that this is often a huge motivation of the people that I'm training and working with, is to first do no harm, to offer teachings in a way that are safe and ultimately supportive of people's transformation. There's one more thing I want to say up front, which is the purpose of this webinar. To me, especially, I'm so thrilled with the different teachers that you're going to be learning from and all these different modules, which are going to come at mindful education from so many different contemporary angles, is that I'm not offering this, this webinar in any way to create fear. The goal that I have for all of you in watching this session is that you come out of this with more knowledge, but especially more confidence about your practice, that you have an increasingly complex toolkit to work with students who may approach you at some point and go, I'm having flashbacks, or I'm having a really hard time with practice, I'm dissociating. How would you work with that? I want you to have as many options as you can in your toolkit so that people can access, students really can access the power of practice. So here's where we're going to be going for this webinar, is I'm going to be focusing primarily on the potential problems that people who've experienced trauma can face inside of mindfulness meditation. My work is about both the healing aspects of mindfulness and also where it can create problems for people. And at this early level of conversation with all of you, I think honing in on the pitfalls or the potholes even of where we can run into problems is some of the most useful time that we can spend here. So, you know, part of the temptation is that, to give you all a top 10 list, like here's the top 10 things that you can do. I have that list that is available, and it's an important part of practice. And to raise consciousness here with all of you, I'm going to be focusing on 3 different things. And specifically, I'm going to focus on what I see as 3 different myths inside of this relationship between trauma and mindfulness. And this is how they go. The first is that mindfulness is a one-size-fits-all practice. The second is that we will necessarily know if someone is struggling with trauma. And the third is that the breath is always a neutral focus of attention for people who are practicing mindfulness and meditation. So first, mindfulness being one size fits all. Second, that we'll necessarily know that someone might be struggling with trauma. And the third is this idea that the breath might be neutral. I'm going to cover these, and I'm going to spend about, I'd say 7 minutes, 8 minutes on each. I'll talk about the myth, why it's a myth. And then I'm going to talk about actually like, well, what can you do inside of it? What are the practices that you can offer? And I wanted to make this as practical as I can. So I'll offer you some examples, give you some different practices, and then you'll have the chance to go on to the other webinars that are here. So before I launch into the 3 different myths that I want to be covering with all of you, I just want to give you a sense of who I am and how I got here. For those of you that I'm meeting for the first time, I came to this topic probably in a way that a lot of you might have around your practice. Meditation's been a really important part of my life for a long time. I was introduced to the practice when I was younger. And then personally, I'm trained as a therapist. So I'm from Canada, trained in Vancouver, Canada. And I've always been fascinated about how people heal. And in my 20s, ended up having a difficult experience at what I'd say is the intersection of meditation and trauma. Long story short, I did a dissertation on this topic, and someone came and they recorded my dissertation defense, which was kind of embarrassing in the moment. But the good news about it is that it actually got out there. I make the joke that it went somewhat viral, which, you know, as much as a dissertation on mindfulness and trauma could go viral. But, you know, it made the rounds. It actually got out there in a lot of different communities, including the mindfulness education community. And a lot of things happened from this video getting out there. But I'd say one of the primary things that brings me to all of you here is that I started to hear from people. I started to get a lot of emails, a lot of correspondence from people who assess themselves as having difficulty inside of meditation because of trauma. So I'd hear from someone who said, I am practicing meditation in a classroom or in this weekly meditation group. I am having flashbacks of a traumatic experience, and I'm finding that this is exacerbating my trauma symptoms. How can I work with this? Or I might meet another person who says, when I'm practicing these mindfulness exercises, could be in a classroom, it also could be on an app. But they say, if I'm practicing, I find that I'm actually leaving my body and dissociating. And when I talk to the teacher or the person that I'm working with, they basically are telling me to go back into practice, but I feel like it's not making things any different at all. Can I talk to you about this? So for a bunch of years, I was hearing from people who were having these difficulties. And eventually, after studying this for a number of years, I had I feel like I had a base level understanding about why this might have been happening. Started to talk to more meditation teachers about it. And I was confident that the mindfulness educators I knew, that they would, of course, they knew what trauma was. I was less convinced that they would know necessarily how to identify it inside of a classroom environment and then how to respond to it skillfully, because that's a whole field and a domain. So eventually a couple of people said, listen, we'd really like you to write a book around this. We want you to compile the best practices. So that's what I did. I wrote a book and it got published last year, and it's called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And I mentioned this to say what the book is a kind of a conglomeration of all the best practices that mindfulness educators can be in around trauma. And that includes anything from working with anchors and how do we work with the breath? What do we do around the body? How do we specifically work with attention? How do we work with others in the classroom? There are so many. There's 64 modifications in the book. And today I'm going to be talking about a couple of them. But I just want you to know that's the conversation that I'm in with people, is what are the best practices that we can in? How do we do well by each other? And I feel really committed inside this topic to be informed by research and then to bring all this to you all who are doing the work, which is what we need. I feel thrilled about this conversation. So one more thing before I dive into the 3 different myths. I'm going to be using the term trauma survivor as a shorthand for people who've experienced trauma who are also struggling with some kind of symptoms of trauma. Now, it's going to be a shorthand. Not everyone who lives through a trauma, of course, will actually develop post-traumatic stress or debilitating symptoms. And I will be using it as a shorthand to say a student in a class that you're working with or one-to-one who's struggling with trauma inside your work. So that's how I'll use trauma survivors. Okay, so I'll cover these 3 different myths. And the first myth is that mindfulness is one size fits all. Now, I just want to say up front, I know that with this audience, that will not be necessarily a big surprise. Many of you will know that you can't just throw mindfulness at something and hope that it'll work. And I think it's useful to just name this aspect of the culture where mindfulness has a very positive reputation, and that impacts how we will offer practices into a room. So let me explain what I mean by that. So for good reason, there's a positive word on the street about mindfulness. We have 35 years of empirical research, including inside of classrooms. And what I've learned inside of that is that most people who I talk to about this topic, they usually have a positive assumption about mindfulness and trauma. So if I'm at a dinner party and someone says, what do you write about? Or I'll say, I talk about mindfulness and trauma. Almost 95% of the time, someone will say, that's so awesome. Mindfulness must be so useful and powerful when it comes to trauma healing, which is true for many people. And then I say, well, actually, my research is looking at both the pros and the cons. And the way of thinking that I've learned about often that people I meet goes something like this. Well, trauma is a form of stress. Mindfulness has been shown to help reduce stress. Therefore, anyone who's experiencing trauma would necessarily benefit from practicing mindfulness meditation. And as I said, it's not to say that's not true for people, but it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach, especially when it comes to trauma. if you took nothing else from this webinar, that's the punchline that I would want you to take home from this, is that not everyone who's struggling with trauma will necessarily have a positive experience inside of mindfulness meditation. In fact, they might be struggling with shame and isolation. And there's many things that you can do to help this person actually access the benefits of practice and have them not fall through the cracks and end up isolated in shame. So I want to tell you a quick story about this to kind of elucidate this. So I work with a student actually, and her name was Jean. I'll call her Jean. Jean was a meditator. She had learned the practice inside of high school and had done some mindful education work, and then had started taking the practice more and more seriously. She had a history of trauma that often left her feeling very unsafe in her body. I won't get into all the details around it, but at any moment she would have this feeling in her chest and also racing thoughts that would have her feel, I feel unsafe right now. And for good reason. She came by that very honestly. What would happen for Jean in her body when she would experience this unsafety is she'd experience tightness in her chest and a constriction in her throat. And Jean found that when she would meditate, this both happened inside the classroom, but also outside, she would start to feel this constriction in her chest and her throat. Now, when she went to her teacher the first few times about this, the teacher inevitably said, just keep being mindful of the constriction. She actually said, the teacher said something like, you could think of this as a tangle in the body, and if you pay mindful attention, the tangle will untangle. And what Jean was saying was, I believe that I'm bringing the best effort that I can to my practice, but I'm often feeling overwhelmed and unsafe at the end of practice. And I just don't know how to work with this. What can I actually do? So I want to pause here for a moment and just say, ask the question, well, what's happening with Jean? What might be going on in this moment? Especially through the lens of trauma. One answer to this question comes from someone named Dr. Peter Levine. And Peter Levine, you may have heard of him. He is the founder of a psychotherapeutic approach to trauma called somatic experiencing. Levine wrote a book called In an Unspoken Voice, which is talking about trauma, trauma healing. And one of the central myths in this is Medusa. He uses the myth of Medusa. And just so you can imagine for a moment, if you don't know the myth, I'll tell you. It's Perseus. It has this task of trying to slay this monster Medusa. And the kind of superpower of Medusa is if you look directly into Medusa's eyes, you freeze and you turn to stone. And what Levine said is, this is a core aspect of working with trauma. And I'll get back to Jean here in a moment. We'll tie this in. What Levine said and what he noticed is that if you focus too quickly on traumatic stimuli, and by that I mean intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, memories, the sensations that Jean was experiencing in the chest or the throat, if you focus too quickly on traumatic stimuli, you can actually freeze and turn to stone. You become immobilized or re-traumatized. And this became a huge part of Levine's work, which I won't get into, which he says, you can't just ask someone struggling with trauma to go right directly into their trauma. What Levine also noticed is that people who have experienced trauma will tend to track for trauma reflexively, both inside and outside. So what that means is if I'm someone who've experienced trauma, I might be tracking for cues in the environment outside me that trauma might happen again, but I'm also tracking inside. So this ties back into Jean for a moment. When Jean would meditate, she would become sensitized to this tightness that happened in her chest and her throat. Now that had been there for many years because of her trauma history. And for Jean, if you think about it, it made sense that she would be paying attention to this sensations. This was a sign that actually something might be wrong or threatening. And again, this isn't a problem per se, but Jean didn't know how to work with this. All that she knew is that she would go to the teacher, and the teacher basically said, keep paying attention to it. And she would keep effectively looking into Medusa's eyes. And eventually Jean was saying, I'm actually just spinning out. I'm finding myself hypervigilant, anxious at the end of this. It's not actually helping me. So the headline here with someone like Jean or students that you're working with is that no matter how much of an effort a student might make inside of mindfulness practice, there are some people who are struggling with trauma who will actually need modifications to their practice. Because if they close their eyes and they go inside, they will go directly at Medusa. They will go directly at the traumatic experiences that are lodged in their mind and their body. Again, not a bad thing, but unless people have tools to navigate that, you're leaving them in Medusa's cave without any actual protection. So then the question is, well, what can you do? You're a teacher, you're in a classroom, you have someone who comes up who says, I'm feeling really anxious about this. I don't know how to work with it. That's really the work that I'm in. And at this level, in this conversation, in this webinar, the first thing you can do is to normalize the experience and just be aware of the fact that it can happen. If there's one thing that I have learned in this work, it's that saying up front to a classroom, if any of you are having a challenging experience, you can come talk to me about it. Just normalizing the fact that people might not all be having a positive experience inside of meditation takes care of a lot inside of a container in a classroom. You know, the people that I met over the years, they would often say, wow, you know, one of the things that was happening to me inside a classroom is that I actually felt shame. I felt embarrassment that it seemed like everyone else was having a really positive experience around their mindfulness practice, but I was feeling stuck and overwhelmed, and I just didn't feel like I could go and talk to the teacher around it. So that's really the headline here, is that at a baseline, you are letting people know if they're having a difficulty, they can actually come and they can talk to you. You could think about this. One of the metaphors I like here is around exercise. My mom, unfortunately, she just broke her arm maybe a month ago, and she's been doing physiotherapy back in Canada. And we've been talking about the practice of like, okay, she's increasing her strength all the time. If you think of trauma as an injury and meditation as an exercise, not everyone who has an injury would necessarily do the same exercise. Like with my mom, it wouldn't make sense for her to be doing just endless push-ups. At some point that might make sense. But at first it might mean that she's actually leaning up against a wall and actually doing some work to strengthen her shoulder. So there might be some people inside of their classrooms who needs particular modifications to actually be able to practice mindfulness, which is an exercise, or you could think of it as an exercise. I'm aware mindfulness is much more vast than that, and the practice of mindfulness meditation is an exercise. So we want to be conscious and aware of the particular injuries that people might be facing, and what are the modifications we can ask. With myth 2 and 3, I'm going to be talking about particular modifications. But that's number one. That is the number one myth, is this idea that mindfulness can kind of be a catch-all solution, or that we can apply it to all different things. And that to me is a myth that I want to bust early on with all of you, especially in this summit. So a second myth that I want to cover is the idea that we will know if someone is experiencing trauma or struggling with trauma inside of their meditation practice. And the reason that I include this is I've met a lot of people who said they were teachers, mindfulness educators, and they said, you know, I'll know if someone is having a hard time. And I want to start by completely dignifying that for all of us, that we do have a strong kind of spidey sense about when someone might be having a hard time in practice. We probably know when to move in and have a conversation with them. So I want to dignify that. And I want to get back to something that I said in the first myth, which is that people who are struggling with trauma or trauma survivors will often be struggling with a great deal of shame and embarrassment about their struggles. There's a lot of barriers that will be in place to them naturally coming to us and saying, hey, I'm having a hard time inside of my mindfulness practice. So I interviewed a teacher at the beginning of my study, maybe 7 years ago, and he said something akin to what I just mentioned. He said, you know, I've been teaching for 15 years, and my sense is that everyone who's come through my training has been fine. I've never had a hard experience happen. And then he read my book, and he actually reached out to me a few years later, and he said, do you know what I realized is that I haven't been tracking for trauma. And when people left my classroom, or the environment that I was teaching mindfulness in, I just assumed that they didn't like it. I didn't actually think, wow, well, maybe they've been having a hard time, or maybe I need to check in with them. And so he said, I've been reflecting on this, and I realized there's been some people that I have actually missed over the years. So we've had a great correspondence ever since then. But I want to just back up for a moment and say, okay, well, what's happening here? Um, what's the environment inside of a classroom that would prevent someone from approaching us, or where is it that we could end up missing someone, a student who's struggling with trauma? And the two things I want to highlight here are shame, which I just talked about, and also compliance. So shame, this is often an experience that comes with trauma. And as I mentioned, so if I tie together that first myth, there is a good word on the street about mindfulness. So people feel like they often feel extra shame if they're having a hard time with a mindfulness practice. A student would feel like, oh my God, I see mindfulness. People seem to be having great experiences. I must be broken. I must be fundamentally flawed if I'm having a difficult experience here. So that's the one level. On one level, there's a barrier to people approaching us recognizing trauma, because people will hide away and they'll hide in their shame. And the second and related piece here has to do with compliance. So compliance is like a submissive response that we will tend to do to people in power or authority. It's a common psychological concept that's been studied in many different ways. There's a whole litany of empirical research about the ways that we will try to please people in power. Think about this for a moment as a mindfulness educator. And I imagine many of you have considered this, thought about it. The ways that people will want to please you in your role. They want you to think of them as a good student. They don't want to tick you off. They don't want to take up your time. They basically want to please you. If you back up for a moment, then think about how this would work with trauma. If someone's having a traumatic experience inside a meditation practice, it's more likely they will tuck away and hide that as opposed to approaching you, unless you have said, in this first myth I talked about that, unless you've said, you're welcome to come talk to me. So just come back to this teacher for a moment. He said, I started to ask around about what had happened, and I realized that people were wanting to please me. And he said, I knew that was there on some level, that they were trying to make me happy, but I didn't realize that I had fallen into that dynamic. I was missing people who were struggling with trauma. So that's myth number 2 that I wanted to cover, is that we will necessarily know that someone's struggling with trauma. There are really, really good reasons that someone might actually be struggling with trauma and not letting us know and hiding it and tucking it away. So then the question is, well, what can we do about this? And I'll start with the overarching principle of this whole webinar here with all of you, is like all of the myths I'll be covering, our awareness of this dynamic is key, absolutely key. But there's also something that we can do and get really skilled at, which is being able to recognize trauma, and especially recognize nonverbal signs of trauma. So for those of you that are one-to-one practitioners, you might be clinicians who are trained to work with trauma, you have the benefit of having direct conversations with people, asking them questions, being able to track the social engagement of the person. For those of us that are working almost exclusively as mindfulness teachers or educators, we might be in a setting where people have their eyes closed. We can't actually make a lot of contact with them. How do we know if they're struggling with trauma? So we can become very skilled at noticing nonverbal signs of trauma. The basic way that we can do this, and again, we could spend an entire webinar here on this topic alone, but it really has to do with looking for when someone's energy, a student that you're working with, when their energy is extremely high or extremely low. I want to have the caveat right up front with all of you that just because someone's energy is high or low does not mean that they're experiencing trauma. Please do not walk up to a student and say, hey, I think that you might have trauma. And it can be a great signifier for us to actually put a flag up and have a conversation with them and go, oh, I noticed that Mark was having it seems like something's up for him. Let me have a conversation. So let me unpack this for a moment. What do I mean energy too high or too low? When it comes to trauma, uh, two key aspects of the nervous system, as you might have heard, are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. This is often talked about as the accelerator and the brakes of a car. Now, often these are fluctuating all day, every day. And this allows us to actually navigate really our lives, get up in the morning, go to bed at night. All these baby fluctuations between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are key. When it comes to trauma, these pedals often fall completely out of whack. Peter Levine actually talks about trauma and post-traumatic stress as having both of these pedals pressed to the floor at the same time. So you can imagine the dysregulation of our brakes and our accelerators are slammed, and the tension that that can create inside of our body. One thing that is common with symptoms of traumatic stress is something known as dysregulated arousal. And that means that this nuanced balance between the accelerator and the brake goes awry. And so sometimes someone who's struggling with trauma will experience something known as hyperarousal or too much arousal. Arousal meaning like our readiness for life. This can be things like hypervigilance, sweating, intrusive thoughts. There's so many different things that can happen when we have too much energy. On the bottom end, we have something known as hypoarousal or too little arousal. The brake is on really strong. What you can look for inside of students is that they're spacey, they're dissociative, which means they're disconnected from their emotional or physical experience. It's like that experience when you're having a conversation with a student that they're there, but somehow they're not really there. So again, there's these two different bands, hyperarousal, too much arousal, or hypoarousal, or too little. That is one of the first things that we can look for inside of a mindfulness environment that someone might be having a problem inside of practice. I've met people who said, when I practiced, I started to sweat, or I'd have an exaggerated startle response, or I would all of a sudden become hypervigilant and have intrusive thoughts, or I would check out. These are all signs that the practice might not actually be supporting someone who's struggling with trauma. So again, I'll back up. We're on myth number 2 here, which is the idea that we will know that someone is necessarily struggling with trauma. And to me, that's a myth. We don't always know. So what can we do? Well, we can definitely make sure that we've created an environment where people will come and tell us, that will unhook them from their shame or their compliance. And then secondly, what we can do is we can become skilled at being able to recognize nonverbal signs of trauma. Again, there's a lot more work, a lot more nuance that we can go into inside of that. But if you just have a basic awareness of what you're looking for, that to me is half the enterprise here. And you'll leave this webinar feeling a lot more prepared. Okay, I'm going to roll into the third myth here before we start to move towards closure. And the third myth really gets particularly around mindfulness meditation and the breath. And the myth is that the breath is necessarily a neutral place for people to focus their attention. That is often a myth. Now, for some of you, you might know that. For me, this was new. This was really new when I learned about this topic. So what do I mean by this? Well, in many traditions, the breath is used as a place to focus our attention and gain some sense of mental stability. So I know in the insight traditions I've been in, or the secular traditions around mindfulness, generally people say, close your eyes, pay attention to your breath. That's the first place that we'll start. And this will enable you to, gain some stability of attention as we move deeper and deeper into practice. What I want to say to all of you here is what I've learned is, and this is also emerging now inside of research, is that the breath can actually create more dysregulation and anxiety for trauma survivors. It is not always a neutral place to focus one's attention. So I'll tell you a brief story about this. I work with a client, and I'll call this client Robin. And he came to me quite frustrated about an experience he had working with the breath. And he was actually working with a really popular meditation app. I won't tell you the name of the app, but he was working with the app. He was really enjoying the practice, and he was finding it was helping him with some stress. And he found that paying attention to the breath was causing him a lot of anxiety. Now, he grew up in an environment with a lot of trauma, I won't get into the details of it. And staying small for Robin was a really smart strategy for him. It basically kept him safe inside of his intimate environment where he grew up with his family. And when he would pay attention to his breath, he would reconnect with this feeling of needing to stay small. And he understood cognitively the way that the breath was actually connecting him to this old traumatic experience he had growing up in his family. And he also took this as a sign of his failing in many ways. He was saying, if I feel like I've done a lot of work on this trauma, I feel like I should be over it. I want to work with the breath. And when the people on the meditation app talk about the breath, they do so in a way that makes it sound like this is a place of refuge. This would naturally be a place like, just gently pay attention to your breath. Let this be such an amazing experience. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But he said there's such a positive bias around the breath that I feel pretty bad about myself when I'm listening to the app. And he was also someone who was just hard on himself. And he's like, I have to be able to learn to work with the breath to be a good meditator. But given his history of trauma, working with the breath was really challenging for him. It wasn't a neutral place of attention. So if we pause there for a moment on Robin and say, okay, well, what's happening for Robin here? Why is the breath not neutral? The short answer is that our respiratory system is intimately connected to our sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system, remember I was talking about the accelerator? This is so deeply connected to traumatic stress, where you've heard of fight flight, no doubt. Fight flight really has to do with our sympathetic nervous system. So if there was a sense of endangerment or threat in someone's past, or if that's happening for them live, a student in the classroom who's experiencing that degree of threat, if they're asked to pay attention to their breath, there's a good chance that will take them right to the traumatic experience that they've either had or that they're having outside of the classroom. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but the body remembers. When we ask people to pay close and sustained attention to their body, we will tend to put them right in front of Medusa. We will tend to be asking them to go right in front of the trauma that they've experienced. And this is really the punchline of a lot of the work that this is what I want to focus on with all of you as mindful educators. If we are asking people to pay close and sustained attention to their body, and their body isn't a neutral place because of trauma, it becomes very hard to cultivate mindful attention. No matter how much effort a student might be making to be able to cultivate mindfulness, if they're not able to find a place in the body to actually rest their attention, to find some mental stability, mindfulness is next to impossible. And so we're just putting someone in a situation where they're actually unable to do the practice that we want them to do. So the breath isn't neutral. The breath really isn't neutral. And what then can we do as mindfulness educators? What are the different moves that we can offer students? The primary thing I want to stress here with all of you as the main option is to be utilizing different anchors of attention. Now, you might already be doing this, and this will be talked about in different aspects of the summit. It will come up in the social emotional learning component. Meena Srinivasan will be here and talking about this. I've talked to Dan Siegel about this. We can use different anchors of attention to help people cultivate mindfulness. And we can do this in many skillful ways. First, let's just talk about what different anchors would be. So if an anchor is a place that we're resting our attention, say the breath, the nostrils, or feeling of the chest rising and falling, we can also use different sensations. So we might say to a group of students, if you'd like to use the sensations of your hands as a place to focus your attention, you can do that. Or it might be your buttocks on a chair or a cushion, or it might be your feet on the floor. There are different anchors in the body that we can offer people that enable them to really establish a solid anchor that will enable them to cultivate mindfulness. It's not like the breath is the be all and end all. The breath is very helpful because it's very dynamic, it's moving, we can come back to it. But you could even try it after this session. You could just take a moment, feel your hands as an anchor, and then try for a minute or two to just let that be your anchor. When your mind wanders into thought, just gently bring your attention back to the anchor of your hands. I think you'll find you can cultivate concentration and the stabilization of attention that way. We can also use sound or hearing. So instead of just being with sensations in the body, you could try it right now with me. You can also use hearing or sound. So what's happening in your soundscape? You might be hearing the sound of my voice. You could also notice what's predominant in your environment right now. And this can also be an anchor. Now, this won't work for everyone. It might be too diffuse. It might be triggering to listen to things outside. But you can use this as a place to come back to inside of mindfulness practice. This is an option for all of you. So you can go ahead and let that go. So I'll say one more thing you can offer, and then I'll go into some review here. There's a group that called Inward Bound Meditation or Mindfulness Education. And Inward Bound, when they are working with young people, they work with students, instead of just starting with the breath, they will actually offer these 3 different anchors in an opening meditation. They'll say, through a guided meditation, I'd like you to start with your breath. Just feel your breath, notice its sensations, anchor your attention there. And then after a minute, they will actually have the person or the student focus on something else, like their hands or their feet. And then they'd say, okay, try this on now. And then they try on sound or hearing. And then at the end of those 3, they'll say, we'd like you to choose one that feels best for you right now. What is the easiest anchor to stabilize your attention here? Or whatever language works for you here inside of your education environment. So that's another thing that we can do to get away from the idea that the breath is the only thing that we can choose to cultivate mindfulness and that all other anchors are somehow secondary. We can actually get really creative with it. We can offer people different practices. And I just want to throw that out there as one example. So to review here about what I've covered, I covered these 3 different myths here around mindfulness. The first is this idea that mindfulness is somehow one size fits all. The second is that we'll necessarily know if a student that we are teaching or working with one-to-one is experiencing trauma. This idea like, oh, no, we'll know. And the third is the idea that the breath is always neutral. We want to complexify all of those and get more and more nuanced. And that's really what I'm up to inside of this work, and what I want to leave you with is the idea that we don't need to be afraid of offering mindfulness practices. Yes, there will be people who are struggling with trauma. You likely know them right now inside your classrooms. Mindfulness won't necessarily cause harm to this person. But if we don't have the awareness of different modifications, the fact that some people might need different exercises, getting back to that metaphor around physiotherapy, if we don't know that, students can fall through the cracks. And if there's one thing that I wanted to cover in this webinar, it's that we're all upping our game here about being able to identify trauma and get more nuanced and complex about the way that we're offering practices. The whole idea of trauma-sensitive work isn't to leave you all feeling afraid, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if someone has a hard time? No, it's actually that you would know what to do and you'd be able to respond effectively if a student came to you and said, I'm struggling. Or if you noticed that a student in your class was having difficulty and you could approach them and you could give them a couple examples about what they could do to access the benefits of practice. That's really what I'm up to. So thanks for being here. Thank you for your interest in this topic. Thank you for being here at this summit. I've been following this summit for a number of years. This seems like a really powerful year with a number of incredible teachers who are here. I'm honored to be a part of this. And I hope that you have a great experience with the rest of your sessions and that you enjoy your rest of time at the summit. Thanks again.